The candles had barely settled into their soft golden glow when the first scream of laughter cut through the ballroom, sharp and cruel, aimed straight at the young woman standing near the tall windows. Eleanor Whitfield froze. Her fingers tightened around her fan as every eye in the room turned toward her. She had known coming to Lord Ashby's ball would be difficult, but she had not expected this. She had not expected to be the center of a storm she never created. "Is it true?" a voice called out from the crowd, dripping with mock sweetness. That Miss Whitfield was seen leaving a gentleman's private study, alone, at midnight. The words landed like stones thrown into still water. Around her, the ripples spread instantly. Fans fluttered, heads turned. Whispers multiplied faster than she could breathe. It was a lie, a complete and shameless lie. But in a room full of powerful families and watching eyes, the truth mattered far less than the story people wanted to believe. Eleanor's cheeks burned. She searched the crowd for her sister, for her mother, for anyone who might step forward and defend her. But the guests only stared, some with pity, most with delight. Scandal was entertainment to these people, and she had just become tonight's show. The man behind the accusation, Lord Cedric Ashby, stood near the fireplace with a smug curve on his lips. Eleanor had rejected his proposal of marriage only weeks earlier, gently but firmly, and it seemed he had chosen a particularly ugly way to answer her refusal. "I have witnesses," Cedric said loudly, enjoying every second of her discomfort. "Reliable ones. It seems Miss Whitfield's reputation is not as spotless as her family would like us to believe." Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her throat had closed with fear and fury all at once. She could feel her mother's eyes on her from across the room, wide with panic, and her younger sister Charlotte, gripping the back of a chair, as though she might faint. Everything Eleanor's family had worked for depended on her name remaining clean. A single evening of gossip could destroy years of careful effort, could close doors that had taken a lifetime to open, could make her sister unmarriageable and her father's business partners nervous. She had done nothing wrong, and yet she stood there, exposed and voiceless, while the room devoured her. Then, from somewhere behind the crowd, a tall figure moved forward with unhurried steps. Duke Alexander Ashworth was not a man who involved himself in the petty dramas of the social season. He was known for his silence, his sharp gaze, and his complete refusal to entertain gossip of any kind. He attended these gatherings out of obligation, not enjoyment, and he rarely spoke to anyone beyond a polite greeting. So when he stepped through the parting crowd, every conversation in the room came to a sudden stop. He did not look at Cedric. He did not acknowledge the whispers. His eyes moved directly to Eleanor, standing pale and trembling near the windows, and something in his expression shifted, quiet and unreadable. "Miss Whitfield," he said, his voice calm, but carrying easily across the silent room. "Forgive my lateness." Eleanor blinked, utterly confused. She had never spoken more than a few words to the Duke in her entire life. She did not understand what he meant by lateness, or why he was addressing her at all in front of everyone. Before she could respond, he closed the last few steps between them, reached for her hand, and lifted it gently to press a kiss against her knuckles, the gesture of a man greeting someone he cared for deeply. The room gasped. Eleanor's heart pounded so hard she feared everyone could hear it. She looked up at him, silently pleading for an explanation, but his eyes held a quiet steadiness that told her to simply follow his lead. "I believe," the Duke continued, turning now to face the crowd, his tone cool and deliberate, "that there has been some confusion this evening. Miss Whitfield was not alone in any study at midnight. She was with me, discussing matters of a personal nature, matters I intend to make official very soon." Whispers turned into stunned silence. Cedric's smug expression cracked. "That is impossible," he said, his voice suddenly less confident. "I have it on good authority." "Then your authority is mistaken," the Duke said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And I would advise you to consider carefully before repeating such claims about a lady who will soon carry my family's name." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Carry his family's name. What was he saying? What had he just done? Around them, the crowd began to murmur again, but this time the tone had shifted entirely. Instead of scandal, there was fascination. Instead of pity, there was awe. A duke, the most eligible and least sociable man in the entire county, had just publicly defended Eleanor Whitfield's honor, and hinted at an engagement no one had ever heard of. Cedric's face turned a deep shade of red. He opened his mouth once more, but the weight of the Duke's title and the certainty in his voice left him no path forward. To continue his accusation now would mean directly challenging one of the most powerful men in the region, a battle Cedric had no hope of winning. He gave a stiff, awkward bow. "Forgive my error, Your Grace," he muttered, before turning and disappearing quickly into the crowd, his humiliation now far greater than anything he had tried to inflict on Eleanor. The orchestra, sensing the tension, began playing again, and slowly the guests returned to their conversations, though many continued to glance toward Eleanor and the Duke with open curiosity. Eleanor stood frozen, still holding his hand without realizing it. Her mind raced through everything that had just happened, unable to fully process it. "Your Grace," she whispered finally, her voice shaking, "what have you done?" Alexander glanced down at her, his expression unreadable, but not unkind. "I have ended a lie before it could grow any larger," he said quietly. "That man intended to ruin your reputation for his own amusement. I could not allow that to happen in my presence." "But you told everyone we are to be married," Eleanor said, her voice barely audible over the music. "That is not true. We have never even spoken more than a few sentences to each other." "I know," he said simply, "but a rumor cannot survive against a stronger truth, even a borrowed one. Right now, the story of your engagement to a duke is far more interesting to this room than the lie Cedric tried to tell. Tomorrow, everyone will be discussing us, not your imagined scandal." Eleanor stared at him, stunned by the calculation behind his sudden intervention. It was clever, it was effective, and it had completely reshaped her evening, her reputation, and quite possibly her entire future, all within a matter of minutes. "You did this without asking me," she said, feeling anger rise beneath her gratitude. "You spoke for me. You made a decision that affects my entire life, without a single word of warning." "I understand your anger," Alexander said, his voice softening slightly. "And you are right to feel it. I acted quickly, because there was no time to explain. But I promise you, Miss Whitfield, I will do everything in my power to make this right, in whatever way you wish." Eleanor searched his face, looking for signs of mockery or manipulation, but found none. His eyes held something steady, almost apologetic, despite the confidence in his earlier words. Across the room, her mother was already making her way toward them, her face a mixture of shock, confusion, and unmistakable excitement. Charlotte followed close behind, practically bouncing with curiosity. "Eleanor," her mother said breathlessly, arriving beside them. "Your Grace, I do not understand what has happened, but I heard the word engagement mentioned, and I simply must know." "Mother," Eleanor said quickly, cutting her off before the situation could spiral even further out of control. "This is not the time or place for this conversation." The Duke, sensing the delicate position Eleanor had been placed in, offered a small bow to her mother. "Mrs. Whitfield, it is a pleasure. I apologize for the abrupt nature of tonight's events. Perhaps we could speak more privately tomorrow, when everyone has had time to gather their thoughts." Eleanor's mother, clearly delighted by the mere suggestion of a private meeting with a duke, nodded eagerly. "Of course, Your Grace, whatever you think best." As her mother and sister stepped away, buzzing with whispered excitement, Eleanor turned back to Alexander, her expression tight with unresolved frustration. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "you and I need to speak, truly speak, because I cannot simply pretend to be engaged to a man I barely know, no matter how noble your intentions were tonight." "Agreed," Alexander said. "Tomorrow, I will explain everything, and you may decide what happens next. I only ask that tonight, you allow the story to stand, for your own protection." Eleanor hesitated, glancing around the room at the many eyes still watching them with interest. She realized, with a heavy heart, that he was right. To contradict his words now, in front of everyone, would only reignite the very scandal he had just extinguished. She had no real choice but to continue the pretense, at least for the remainder of the evening. "Very well," she said finally, her voice tight. "But only for tonight." Alexander offered her his arm, and after a moment of hesitation, she accepted it, allowing him to lead her through the crowd, toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, away from the curious stares. As they walked, Eleanor's mind spun with questions. Why had a man known for his coldness and distance chosen, in that single moment, to step forward and defend a woman he barely knew. What had he seen in her, standing helpless against Cedric's cruelty, that moved him to act so boldly? She glanced up at him as they walked, studying the sharp line of his jaw, the quiet intensity in his eyes, searching for some clue to the man behind the title. He caught her gaze and offered the faintest hint of a smile, the first genuine expression she had seen from him all evening. "You are wondering why I did it," he said, almost as though reading her thoughts. "Yes," Eleanor admitted, "I am." "I will tell you tomorrow," he said. "Tonight, simply allow yourself to breathe. The danger has passed, at least for now." Eleanor nodded slowly, though her heart still raced with uncertainty. As they reached a quieter section of the room, she allowed herself, for the first time that evening, to exhale fully. The scandal had been avoided. Her reputation, for tonight at least, remained intact. But as she glanced once more at the tall, composed man beside her, she understood that a new and far more complicated chapter of her life had just begun, one she had never asked for, and could not yet predict. Somewhere across the ballroom, Cedric watched them from the shadows near the entrance, his face still burning with humiliation. His pride had been wounded, badly, and as he stepped out into the cool night air, a dangerous thought began to form in his mind. If Alexander Ashworth believed a single kiss and a bold announcement could erase the damage he intended, he was sadly mistaken. Cedric was not a man who accepted defeat easily, and he had no intention of allowing tonight's humiliation to be his final word. Behind him, inside the warmly lit ballroom, Eleanor Whitfield stood beside a duke she barely knew, her future suddenly tangled with his, in ways she could not yet understand, while outside, in the darkness, the seeds of a much larger conflict had already begun to take root. Neither of them could know, in that fragile, uncertain moment, just how much their lives were about to change, nor how deeply intertwined their fates had already become, with a single, unexpected kiss. The sun had barely risen over the Whitfield estate, when a carriage bearing the Ashworth crest rolled up the gravel drive, its wheels crunching loudly enough to draw curtains open across every window in the house. Eleanor had not slept. She had spent the entire night replaying the ballroom scene over and over in her mind, the sudden kiss on her hand, the shocked faces of the crowd, the strange calm in the Duke's voice as he rewrote her reputation in a matter of seconds. By the time dawn broke, she was exhausted, anxious, and utterly unprepared for the conversation ahead. Her mother, however, had slept beautifully and was already dressed in her finest morning gown, practically glowing with excitement as she rushed down the stairs. "He is early," her mother said breathlessly, peering through the front window. "That is a good sign, Eleanor. Punctual men make reliable husbands." "Mother, please," Eleanor said, pressing her fingers to her temples. "There is no engagement. Not truly. Last night was a performance, nothing more." "A performance witnessed by half the county," her mother reminded her, not unkindly, but firmly. "Whatever his reasons, the story is already spreading. We must handle this carefully, or the damage could be far worse than anything Cedric intended." Eleanor knew her mother was right, but the knowledge did nothing to calm the storm inside her. She smoothed the front of her pale blue morning dress, took a steadying breath, and walked toward the drawing room, just as the butler announced their visitor. Duke Alexander Ashworth entered with the same quiet composure he had shown the night before, though there was something slightly different in his posture this morning, a faint trace of uncertainty beneath his usual confidence. "Miss Whitfield," he said, bowing politely. "Mrs. Whitfield, thank you for receiving me so early." "Of course, Your Grace," Eleanor's mother said warmly, gesturing toward the seating area near the tall windows. "Please, sit. I shall have tea brought in immediately." As her mother hurried off to instruct the servants, an uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Eleanor remained standing near the fireplace, arms crossed, studying the man who had upended her life with a single gesture less than 12 hours earlier. "You look as though you did not sleep," Alexander said quietly, breaking the silence. "I did not," Eleanor replied sharply. "How could I, after what happened?" He nodded, accepting the accusation without argument. "That is fair. I imagine last night left you with far more questions than answers." "You imagine correctly," Eleanor said. "Let us begin with the most obvious one. Why did you do it? You do not know me. We have exchanged perhaps a dozen words in our entire lives. most of them polite nonsense at gatherings neither of us wished to attend. Alexander was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I have watched Cedric Ashby behave this way toward others before," he said finally. Quietly, cleverly, always leaving himself room to deny it later. He targets those who have rejected him, or those who threaten his pride in some way. Last night, I recognized the pattern immediately, and I could not stand by and allow it to happen again. "So this was about him," Eleanor said, "not about me." "It began that way," Alexander admitted. "But watching you stand there, refusing to break down despite everyone staring, despite the humiliation being forced upon you, I found myself unable to simply walk away. You showed remarkable strength in that moment, Miss Whitfield, even though you likely did not feel strong at all." Eleanor's anger softened slightly at his words, though her guard remained firmly in place. "Strength or not, you made a decision that affects my entire future, without asking me first. Do you understand what you have done? My mother believes we are to be married. The entire county likely believes the same by now. And you offer me an explanation about noticing a pattern in Cedric's behavior. You are right to be angry," Alexander said, his voice steady. "And I do not ask you to forgive me easily. I only ask that you allow me to correct this properly, in whatever manner causes you the least harm." "And how exactly do you propose we correct it?" Eleanor asked. "Shall we announce to the entire ballroom that the engagement was invented on the spot? That would only invite more talk, not less." Alexander leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. "I have considered this carefully through the night. I believe our best course is to allow the engagement to stand, publicly, for a period of time. Long enough for the story of Cedric's claim to fade from memory. Long enough for your reputation to fully recover, under the protection of my family's name. After several months, we can quietly announce that circumstances have changed, and the engagement has ended amicably. No further talk, no blame, placed on either of us." Eleanor stared at him, stunned by the boldness of the suggestion. "You want me to pretend to be engaged to you, for months? I understand. It is an enormous request," Alexander said, "and I recognize the inconvenience it places upon you, upon your own hopes for marriage and happiness. I am prepared to compensate your family generously for the disruption this causes, and I give you my word that during this arrangement, your reputation and comfort will be protected above all else." Before Eleanor could respond, her mother returned with the tea tray, practically glowing with delight as she caught the tail end of the conversation. "An arrangement," she repeated eagerly. "Oh, Eleanor, do say yes. Think of what this means for your sister, for your father's standing among his business associates, for the entire family." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of expectation pressing down from every direction. Her mother's hope, her sister's future, her own reputation, all balanced precariously on a decision she had not asked to make. "I need time to think," Eleanor said finally, her voice quieter now. "This is not a small request, Your Grace. You are asking me to keep up appearances for everyone I know, for months, about the nature of my own life. Take whatever time you need," Alexander said. "I will not press you further today, but I ask that you consider the alternative as well. If we correct last night's events too quickly, Cedric will seize the opportunity to revive his original claims, and this time, there will be no explanation that saves you from the damage." Eleanor knew he was right, and the realization frustrated her even further. She had been placed into an impossible position, through no fault of her own, and now she was being asked to choose between two equally uncomfortable paths. "Give me until tomorrow," she said finally. "I will give you my answer then." Alexander nodded, rising from his seat. "That is more than reasonable. Thank you for hearing me out, Miss Whitfield, even when you had every right to refuse." After he departed, Eleanor remained in the drawing room, long after her mother had rushed off to write letters to relatives, undoubtedly sharing the exciting news, despite Eleanor's request for discretion. She sat by the window, watching the Ashworth carriage disappear down the long drive, her mind spinning with the weight of the decision ahead of her. Later that afternoon, her younger sister Charlotte found her still sitting in the same spot, staring out at the gardens with an unreadable expression. "You are thinking about the Duke," Charlotte said, settling into the chair beside her. "I am thinking about everything," Eleanor admitted. "My reputation, our family, and now this strange arrangement he has proposed. It feels as though my entire future has been decided in the space of a single evening, without my consent." Charlotte studied her sister carefully. Do you dislike him? The Duke, I mean. Setting aside the circumstances, Eleanor considered the question seriously. I do not know him well enough to dislike him, she said finally. But there was something in the way he spoke this morning. Something honest, beneath all his careful calculations. He did not pretend the situation was simple, or that his actions were without consequence. He acknowledged the difficulty he has caused me. That sounds like more consideration than most men show, Charlotte said gently. Perhaps, Eleanor said, but consideration does not erase the fact that my life has been rearranged without my permission. I am upset with him, Charlotte, even as I understand why he acted as he did. Charlotte reached over and took her sister's hand. Whatever you decide, I will support you. But do consider this, Eleanor. If Cedric truly intended to destroy your reputation out of spite, the Duke's actions may have saved you from a far worse outcome than a temporary pretend engagement. Eleanor knew her sister was right, and the knowledge did little to soften the frustration still simmering beneath her exhaustion. That evening, she wrote in her private journal, trying to untangle her thoughts on paper since her mind refused to settle them on its own. She wrote of Cedric's cruelty, of the strange kindness hidden within Alexander's boldness, of the impossible choice now resting entirely on her shoulders. She wrote until her candle burned low, and finally, as the house fell silent around her, she reached a decision. The following morning, when the Ashworth carriage returned exactly as promised, Eleanor met Alexander in the same drawing room, her expression calm and resolved. I have considered your proposal carefully, she said, before he could even offer a greeting, and I will agree to the arrangement, under specific conditions. Alexander's eyebrows lifted slightly, clearly not expecting such directness. I am listening. First, Eleanor said, you will treat me as an equal partner in this arrangement, not simply a woman you are protecting. Any decisions regarding our public appearances, our story, our eventual separation, will be made together, not decided for me. Agreed, Alexander said without hesitation. Second, Eleanor continued, you will be honest with me at all times, even when the truth is uncomfortable. I have had enough of half-explanations and decisions made behind my back. You have my word, Alexander said. Third, Eleanor said, her voice softening slightly, if at any point this arrangement becomes too difficult, for either of us, we will end it immediately, regardless of the consequences to our reputations. I would rather face difficulty honestly than continue something that causes genuine harm. Alexander studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering behind his eyes. I accept every condition, he said, and I thank you, Miss Whitfield, for trusting me enough to attempt this, even under such difficult circumstances. Eleanor extended her hand, and this time, when he took it, the gesture felt entirely different from the dramatic kiss in the crowded ballroom. It felt like the beginning of a partnership neither of them had ever expected to form, built on necessity, but perhaps, in time, capable of becoming something far more genuine. Neither of them could yet imagine how quickly the lines between pretense and reality would begin to blur, nor how deeply this arrangement would test both their hearts before the truth of their story could finally be told. 3 weeks passed, and the arrangement between Eleanor and Alexander settled into a strange, careful rhythm neither of them had expected to manage so smoothly. They appeared together at church on Sundays, walked side by side through the market square on Thursday afternoons, and attended 2 small dinners hosted by families, eager to secure favor with the Duke through his soon-to-be bride. Each appearance was carefully planned the night before, every gesture and word discussed in advance, until the performance began to feel almost natural. Almost, but not entirely. Eleanor still caught herself holding her breath whenever Alexander reached for her hand in public, still felt a flush rise to her cheeks whenever he offered her a compliment meant for the watching crowd rather than for her alone. She told herself it meant nothing, that her body was simply reacting to the strangeness of pretending, but some quiet part of her had begun to suspect otherwise. One afternoon, as they walked through the gardens behind the Ashworth estate, away from prying eyes for the first time in days, Eleanor finally allowed herself to ask a question that had been growing in her mind. Tell me about your family, she said, glancing up at him as they walked beneath a row of blooming apple trees. You mentioned once that your parents were no longer living, but nothing beyond that. Alexander's expression shifted, the easy calm he wore in public, replaced by something more guarded. "My father passed when I was 19, he said quietly. "A sudden illness, quick but merciless. My mother followed only 2 years later, though the physicians called her illness grief, rather than any disease they could name." "I am sorry," Eleanor said softly. "That must have been an enormous burden to carry so young." "It was," Alexander admitted. "I inherited the title, the estate, and every responsibility that came with them. Before I had even finished grieving, there was no time to be young and lost. I had tenants depending on me, business matters demanding my attention, and an entire household looking to me for guidance I did not feel prepared to give." Eleanor considered this new information carefully, seeing the Duke in an entirely different light. The cold reserve she had always associated with him no longer seemed like arrogance, but something closer to armor, built out of necessity rather than pride. "Is that why you keep yourself apart from society?" she asked. "Because you learned early that people expect too much, and giving too much of yourself only leads to exhaustion?" Alexander glanced at her, surprised by the accuracy of her observation. "That is precisely why," he admitted. "I discovered quickly that most people who sought my company wanted something from my title, not from me personally. It became easier to remain distant than to constantly wonder which motive was genuine." "And yet you stepped forward for me," Eleanor said, "a woman you barely knew, at great personal cost to your own carefully maintained distance." Alexander was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Perhaps that is precisely why I could not walk away," he said finally. "You did not seek my attention, Miss Whitfield. You did not flatter me, or angle for my favor, or attempt to secure my interest through calculated charm. You were simply standing there, wronged and alone, needing someone to intervene. There was nothing false about the moment, and I found I could not turn my back on something so genuine." Eleanor felt her chest tighten at his words, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through her, despite her earlier resolve to keep emotional distance from this entire arrangement. She reminded herself firmly that this was still, at its core, a performance meant to protect her reputation, nothing more. "We should discuss the dinner tomorrow evening," she said, changing the subject deliberately. "The Marchbanks family has a reputation for asking pointed questions. We should agree upon our answers in advance." Alexander nodded, though something in his expression suggested he had noticed her deliberate shift away from the personal conversation. "Of course," he said. "What concerns you most?" "They will likely ask how we met," Eleanor said. "Our actual story, involving Cedric's cruelty and your sudden intervention, is far too dramatic for polite conversation. We should agree upon something simpler. Perhaps the truth, softened slightly," Alexander suggested. "We could say we were introduced at a mutual friends gathering some months ago, and that our acquaintance grew slowly into something deeper before either of us realized it." "That seems reasonable," Eleanor agreed. "Simple enough to remember, close enough to reality, that we will not contradict ourselves through careless slips." As they continued walking, discussing the details of their invented history with careful precision, Eleanor found herself struck by how easily they worked together, each anticipating the other's concerns, filling gaps in the story with matching instincts. It was, she realized, an unusual kind of partnership, built on necessity, but strengthened through genuine cooperation. That evening at dinner, exactly as predicted, Lady Marchbanks leaned forward with obvious curiosity as the final course was served. "Do tell us, Your Grace, how did you and Miss Whitfield first become acquainted?" "Such a whirlwind engagement has left the entire county buzzing with curiosity," Alexander answered smoothly, exactly as they had rehearsed, describing a quiet introduction through mutual friends, a slow-growing fondness discovered gradually over shared conversations. Eleanor added small details of her own, laughing softly at appropriate moments, playing her role with a confidence that surprised even herself. "How romantic," Lady Marchbanks sighed, clearly satisfied with the story. "It is refreshing to see a match built on genuine affection, rather than mere convenience. So many arrangements among the nobility these days feel entirely transactional." Eleanor caught Alexander's eye across the table for the briefest moment, and something unspoken passed between them. A shared awareness of the irony hidden within Lady Marchbanks's innocent comment. Their arrangement was, after all, exactly the kind of transaction she had just praised them for avoiding. Later, as their carriage rolled back toward the Whitfield estate through the quiet countryside, Eleanor allowed herself a small laugh, the tension of the evening finally releasing from her shoulders. She has no idea, Eleanor said, shaking her head. None whatsoever. None at all, Alexander agreed, a rare smile appearing on his face. You performed admirably tonight, Miss Whitfield. I nearly believed the story myself. High praise indeed, Eleanor said, coming from a man who invented half the details on the spot. Their easy laughter filled the carriage, warm and genuine, entirely unlike the careful performances they had maintained throughout the evening. For a brief moment, Eleanor forgot entirely about reputations and arrangements and calculated stories, simply enjoying the company of a man whose presence she had come to anticipate rather than merely endure. But as the carriage rolled to a stop outside her family home, reality returned swiftly. Standing near the entrance, watching their arrival with narrowed eyes, was Cedric Ashby, his expression carrying none of the humiliation he had shown weeks earlier, but something far more calculating instead. Eleanor's stomach tightened immediately. "What is he doing here?" she whispered. Alexander's easy expression vanished instantly, replaced by the same cold composure she remembered from their first meeting. "I do not know," he said quietly, "but we should proceed carefully. A man like Cedric rarely appears without a plan already in motion." As they stepped down from the carriage, Cedric offered an exaggerated bow, his smile carrying none of its earlier warmth, only a sharp, dangerous edge that sent a chill through Eleanor despite the mild evening air. "Your Grace, Miss Whitfield," Cedric said smoothly. "I do hope I am not interrupting anything important. I simply wish to offer my congratulations properly, given the circumstances of our last encounter." "That is unnecessary," Alexander said firmly, stepping slightly in front of Eleanor. "Whatever business you believe you have here can wait until a more appropriate hour." "On the contrary," Cedric said, his smile widening, "I believe my business is quite urgent. You see, Your Grace, I have recently learned some rather interesting information about the true nature of your sudden engagement, information I suspect neither of you would wish to become public knowledge." Eleanor's heart pounded as she watched the confidence in Cedric's expression, wondering exactly what he believed he had discovered, and how much danger his knowledge truly posed to the fragile arrangement they had worked so carefully to maintain. The evening air suddenly felt colder, as Eleanor stood beside Alexander, watching Cedric's smug expression with growing unease. "Interesting information," Alexander repeated, his voice carefully controlled, despite the tension visible in his jaw. "I would advise you to be very precise about what you claim to know, Ashby, before you say something you cannot take back." Cedric chuckled softly, clearly enjoying the discomfort he had created. "A stable hand from your estate mentioned to a friend of mine that your household staff has been given unusual instructions regarding Miss Whitfield's visits. Separate quarters prepared, no wedding preparations underway, despite the engagement being announced weeks ago, and strict instructions that certain letters addressed to Miss Whitfield be redirected through your personal secretary, rather than delivered directly. Peculiar arrangements for a couple genuinely planning marriage, would you not agree?" Eleanor's blood ran cold. She had not realized their careful arrangement had left such visible traces, small inconsistencies, that a suspicious mind could easily piece together into something far more damaging than the truth itself. "Household matters are hardly your concern," Alexander said coolly, though Eleanor could sense the effort behind his composed tone. "Many engaged couples maintain careful separation before marriage, particularly given the importance my family places on propriety." "Perhaps," Cedric said, stepping closer with deliberate slowness, "or perhaps this engagement is nothing more than a convenient story, invented to save Miss Whitfield's reputation after our encounter at the ball. Tell me, Your Grace, how would society react if they learned the truth? That the great Duke Ashworth, known for his unshakable honesty, has been maintaining an elaborate deception before all of them?" "You have no proof of any deception," Eleanor said sharply, finding her voice despite the fear tightening her chest. "Only the gossip of a stable hand and your own bitter imagination." Cedric turned his attention to her, his expression darkening slightly. "Bitter imagination. How amusing, coming from the woman who humiliated me in front of half the county by rejecting my proposal, only to somehow secure a duke's affection within the same season. Forgive me if I find the timing suspicious." "You were never rejected out of cruelty," Eleanor said firmly. "I simply did not share your feelings. That is not humiliation, Cedric. That is honesty. Something you seem entirely unfamiliar with. Cedric's expression flickered with genuine anger for the first time, the careful control he had maintained slipping momentarily. Careful, Miss Whitfield, I have far more influence than you realize, and I am not above using every piece of information available to me, if provoked further. Is that a threat? Alexander asked, his voice low and dangerous, stepping fully between Eleanor and Cedric now. Consider it a warning, Cedric said, straightening his coat with exaggerated calm. I intend to discover the truth behind this engagement, one way or another, and when I do, I will ensure that everyone who matters learns exactly how it began. Good evening to you both. With a final mocking bow, Cedric turned and walked toward his waiting carriage, leaving Eleanor and Alexander standing in tense silence beneath the moonlight. He knows, Eleanor whispered once Cedric's carriage had disappeared down the drive. Or at least, he suspects enough to cause real damage if he continues digging. We must be more careful, Alexander said, his expression grim. I will speak with my staff immediately, ensure no further details slip through careless conversation, but I fear Cedric will not simply abandon this pursuit. Men driven by wounded pride rarely give up so easily. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling the full weight of the danger they had invited into their lives. What if he finds proof? What if he manages to convince others that our engagement is false? Then we will face that difficulty when it arrives, Alexander said, though his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. For now, we must simply continue as we have, careful and consistent, giving him no further opportunity to gather evidence. Over the following days, Eleanor found herself watching every servant, every visitor, every casual conversation with newfound suspicion, wondering which small detail might eventually find its way to Cedric's ears. The strain began to show in small ways: sleepless nights, distracted conversations, a growing tension that neither she nor Alexander could fully hide, despite their best efforts. One afternoon, as Eleanor sat in the drawing room, attempting to focus on a book she had read 3 times, without absorbing a single sentence, Charlotte entered quietly and settled beside her. You seem troubled, Charlotte said gently, more than usual, even considering everything happening with the engagement. Eleanor hesitated, unsure how much to share even with her own sister, but the weight of her worry eventually overcame her caution. Or suspects enough to cause serious trouble if he continues investigating. Charlotte's eyes widened with concern. What will you do? I do not know, Eleanor said honestly. Alexander believes we must simply continue as we have, hoping Cedric cannot gather enough proof to convince others, but I fear that strategy alone will not be enough to stop him. Perhaps, Charlotte said thoughtfully, you should consider a different approach entirely. Instead of merely defending against his suspicions, why not discover why he is so determined to expose you? Men rarely pursue such dangerous paths without deeper motivations than simple wounded pride. Eleanor considered her sister's suggestion carefully. It was true that Cedric's determination seemed to exceed even the humiliation he had suffered at the ballroom. There was something else driving him, some deeper motivation she had not yet fully understood. That evening, when Alexander arrived for their scheduled visit, Eleanor shared Charlotte's suggestion, watching his expression shift thoughtfully as he considered the idea. You may be right, Alexander admitted. Cedric's behavior has always struck me as excessive, even before this situation began. Perhaps there is something in his past, some pattern of behavior, that might explain his current determination. Do you know anything of his history? Eleanor asked. Beyond his reputation in society? Alexander was quiet for a moment, clearly searching his memory. I recall hearing, some years ago, that Cedric was once engaged to a young woman from a neighboring county. The engagement ended suddenly, under circumstances that were never fully explained. Perhaps there is a connection worth investigating. How do we investigate such a thing discreetly? Eleanor asked. We cannot simply ask him directly. I have connections who might know more, Alexander said. Business associates who have dealt with Cedric's family in the past. I will make careful inquiries without revealing our true purpose. Over the following week, Alexander pursued this new avenue of investigation quietly, while Eleanor continued maintaining their public arrangement with careful precision, always watching for signs that Cedric had gathered further proof against them. Finally, during one of their evening walks through the gardens, Alexander shared what he had discovered. The young woman Cedric was once engaged to, he said. Her name was Margaret Fenwick. The engagement ended when her family discovered Cedric had been secretly pursuing her inheritance, rather than genuine affection. Her father broke the engagement immediately upon learning the truth, and Cedric's reputation suffered considerably as a result, though the full details were kept quiet to protect Margaret's own reputation. Eleanor absorbed this information slowly, pieces beginning to fall into place. So his pursuit of me, his anger at my rejection, may have less to do with genuine feelings and more to do with wounded pride from a previous failure. Precisely, Alexander said. I suspect Cedric sees each rejection as confirmation of some deeper insecurity, and rather than confronting that insecurity honestly, he lashes out at those who reveal it. This does not solve our immediate problem, Eleanor said. Even understanding his motivations, we still face the danger of his continued investigation into our engagement. No, Alexander agreed, but understanding an opponent's weaknesses often reveals opportunities that strength alone cannot provide. Perhaps, if we approach this carefully, we can find a way to neutralize his threat without further scandal for anyone involved. As they continued walking through the quiet gardens, discussing possible strategies for the difficult days ahead, Eleanor found herself grateful, despite everything, that she was not facing this challenge alone. Whatever had begun as a hasty, impulsive decision on a crowded ballroom floor had grown into something far more complex. A genuine partnership built through shared difficulty and mutual respect. Yet even as she allowed herself this small comfort, a nagging worry remained at the edges of her mind. Cedric was clearly not a man who abandoned his pursuits easily, and whatever plan he was quietly assembling, Eleanor suspected the most difficult confrontation was still waiting for them, somewhere in the days ahead. A full month had passed since the confrontation outside the Whitfield estate, and to Eleanor's quiet relief, Cedric had made no further appearances, no further threats, no visible movement toward whatever scheme he had promised to pursue. The silence, rather than comforting her, only deepened her unease. A man as prideful as Cedric rarely abandoned a pursuit without achieving some form of satisfaction, and Eleanor found herself constantly waiting for the moment his plan would finally reveal itself. In the meantime, life within the strange arrangement between herself and Alexander had continued to deepen in ways neither of them had anticipated. Their public appearances, once carefully rehearsed performances, had gradually become something closer to genuine companionship. Eleanor found herself looking forward to their walks through the gardens, their quiet conversations over tea, the easy comfort that had grown between them despite the artificial foundation upon which their engagement rested. One particular afternoon, as autumn began settling over the countryside with its golden light and cooling air, Alexander invited Eleanor to visit the eastern edge of his estate, an area he rarely showed to visitors. This was my mother's favorite place, he explained, as they walked along a narrow path leading toward a small, quiet lake surrounded by willow trees. She used to bring me here as a child, long before my father's illness, long before any of the responsibilities that followed. Eleanor glanced around at the peaceful scene, understanding immediately why such a place would hold such significance. It is beautiful, she said softly. I can see why she loved it here. She used to say, this was the one place where she could simply exist as herself, rather than as a duchess expected to perform certain duties. Alexander continued, his voice carrying a rare softness Eleanor had not heard from him before. I have not brought anyone here since her passing. Eleanor felt something shift within her chest at his words, recognizing the significance of what he had just shared. Why bring me now? She asked quietly. Alexander considered the question for a long moment before answering. Because these past weeks, despite everything complicated about our arrangement, you have become someone I trust in ways I did not expect. I find myself wanting to share pieces of my life that I have kept hidden from nearly everyone else. Eleanor's heart raced at his admission, uncertain how to respond to such unexpected honesty. She had spent weeks reminding herself that their engagement was merely a performance, a temporary solution to a difficult problem. Yet moments like this one made such reminders increasingly difficult to believe. I feel the same, she admitted quietly, surprising even herself with her own honesty. This arrangement began as something forced upon us both, yet somehow, I find myself grateful for it, despite all the difficulty and uncertainty it has created. They sat together near the edge of the lake, watching the golden light reflect softly across the water, neither speaking for a long while. simply enjoying the comfortable silence that had grown so naturally between them. "May I ask you something personal?" Eleanor said finally, breaking the quiet. "Of course," Alexander replied. "Have you ever considered marriage, genuinely, before all of this happened? Before Cedric, before the ballroom, before any of this arrangement began?" Alexander was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "I had resigned myself to a marriage of convenience eventually," he admitted. "Someone suitable, someone who understood the demands of my position, but not necessarily someone I genuinely cared for. I had convinced myself that such an arrangement was simply the reality of my situation." "And now?" Eleanor asked softly, unsure why her heart pounded so intensely as she waited for his answer. Alexander turned to look at her directly, his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "Now, I find myself wondering whether that resignation was simply a lack of imagination on my part, rather than an actual limitation of reality." Eleanor felt her breath catch at the weight of his words, understanding the implication behind them, even as neither of them spoke it directly. The silence between them grew charged with unspoken possibility, until finally, Alexander reached over and gently took her hand, his fingers intertwining carefully with hers. "Eleanor," he said quietly, using her given name for the first time since their arrangement began. "I know our engagement began as nothing more than a necessary deception, but I find myself increasingly unable to separate the performance from what I genuinely feel when I am with you." Eleanor's heart pounded fiercely as she absorbed his words, recognizing the same confusion of emotion within herself that he had just described. "I feel it too," she whispered. "I have tried to convince myself these feelings are simply confusion, born from spending so much time together under difficult circumstances, but I no longer believe that explanation is entirely true." Alexander studied her carefully, searching her expression for any hesitation before he leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished. When she did not, he closed the remaining distance between them, and this time, unlike the dramatic performance in the crowded ballroom, their kiss was quiet, gentle, and entirely genuine. When they finally parted, Eleanor felt a warmth spreading through her chest, unlike anything she had experienced before. An emotion far removed from the fear and confusion of that first public kiss weeks earlier. "This changes things," she said softly, still catching her breath. "Yes," Alexander agreed, his voice equally unsteady. "I find I am no longer entirely certain how to proceed within the boundaries of our original arrangement." "Perhaps," Eleanor said carefully, "we do not need to remain within those boundaries any longer." Alexander's expression softened with something close to relief. "Are you suggesting what I believe you are suggesting?" "I am suggesting," Eleanor said, a small smile finally breaking through her earlier uncertainty, "that perhaps this engagement need not end in a few months, as we originally planned. Perhaps, given time, it could become something real." Alexander's answering smile was unlike anything Eleanor had seen from him before, warm and unguarded, a genuine happiness replacing the careful composure he typically maintained. "I would like that very much," he said quietly. "More than I believe I have wanted anything, in a very long time." As they sat together beside the quiet lake, the golden autumn light slowly beginning to fade into evening, Eleanor allowed herself, for the first time since this entire complicated situation began, to imagine a future with genuine hope rather than careful calculation. Yet even in this peaceful, hopeful moment, a small worry lingered at the edges of her thoughts. Their growing feelings for one another had complicated an already delicate situation, and Cedric's continued silence remained an unresolved threat hanging over their newfound happiness. As they finally rose to walk back toward the main estate, hands still intertwined, neither of them could have predicted just how quickly that lingering threat was about to resurface, nor how severely it would test the genuine feelings they had only just begun to acknowledge between them. 3 days after the quiet moment beside the lake, Eleanor received an unexpected letter, delivered by a messenger she did not recognize, sealed with no identifying mark. Curious and slightly uneasy, she opened it privately in her bedroom, away from the curious eyes of her mother and sister. The handwriting inside was unfamiliar, careful and precise, and as she read the contents, her stomach twisted with dread. The letter claimed to be from a former servant of the Ashby household, someone who had witnessed private conversations between Cedric and his associates over the past several weeks. According to the letter, Cedric had hired investigators to examine the Whitfield family's financial records, searching for any information that might explain why Eleanor would suddenly attract the attention of a duke so soon after rejecting his own proposal. More troubling still, the letter mentioned that Cedric had discovered correspondence between Eleanor's father and a business associate. Correspondence that revealed the Whitfield family's finances were far less stable than publicly known. Eleanor's father had been quietly seeking loans to cover certain business losses, information that, if made public, could severely damage the family's reputation, regardless of Eleanor's engagement to a duke. Eleanor's hands trembled as she finished reading the letter. She had known her father's business had faced some difficulties recently, but she had not realized the situation was severe enough to require secret loans, nor had she understood how easily such information could be weaponized against her family. She immediately sought out her father in his study, finding him hunched over a stack of papers, his expression tired and strained in ways she had not noticed before. "Father," she said carefully, closing the door behind her, "I need to ask you something important, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Her father looked up, surprised by the seriousness in her tone. "Of course, Eleanor. What troubles you? Is it true that our family's finances are in difficulty? That you have been seeking loans to cover business losses?" Her father's face paled slightly, confirming her worst suspicions before he even spoke. "Where did you hear such a thing?" "That does not matter right now," Eleanor said. "What matters is whether it is true, and how serious the situation truly is." Her father sighed heavily, gesturing for her to sit across from him. "The truth is more complicated than simple difficulty," he admitted. "Several of my business investments failed over the past year, losses larger than I initially anticipated. I have been seeking loans quietly, hoping to stabilize our situation before anyone noticed the strain." "And if this information became public?" Eleanor asked, though she already feared the answer. "It would be devastating," her father admitted quietly. "Not only to our family's reputation, but to any business relationships I have carefully maintained over the years. Creditors would lose confidence immediately, and our situation could worsen considerably." Eleanor absorbed this information with growing alarm, understanding now the full weight of the threat contained within the mysterious letter. Cedric was not simply attempting to expose her false engagement. He had discovered a far more devastating weapon, one capable of destroying her entire family's financial stability, regardless of her relationship with Alexander. That evening, Eleanor shared the letter with Alexander, watching his expression grow increasingly serious as he read through its contents. "This is far more dangerous than I anticipated," Alexander said finally, setting the letter down carefully. "Cedric is not simply seeking revenge for wounded pride any longer. He has found genuine leverage, something capable of causing real, lasting harm to your family." "What do we do?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with worry. "If he exposes this information publicly, my father's business relationships will collapse, regardless of anything else happening between us." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, clearly considering their limited options carefully. "I have resources that could help stabilize your father's situation," he said finally. "I could quietly provide the necessary funds to cover his debts, removing Cedric's leverage entirely before he has the opportunity to use it." Eleanor shook her head immediately. "I cannot ask that of you. It is far too generous a gesture, and my father would never accept charity, even from someone he respects." "It would not need to be framed as charity," Alexander said carefully. "I could structure it as a business investment, a genuine opportunity that happens to provide your father the capital he requires. Many wealthy families assist one another in such matters, particularly families soon to be joined through marriage." Eleanor considered this suggestion, recognizing both its practicality and its complications. "Even if we could convince my father to accept such help, it would not resolve the true problem. Cedric could still expose the information out of spite, even without the practical leverage of my father's financial vulnerability." "That is true," Alexander admitted, "which means we must address Cedric directly, rather than simply defending against whatever weapon he intends to use next." "How do you propose we do that?" Eleanor asked. "He has shown no willingness to listen to reason, and threatening him directly would only provoke further retaliation." Alexander considered the question carefully before answering. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we do not threaten him. Perhaps we offer him something he genuinely wants, something valuable enough that exposing us no longer serves his interests. And what exactly would that be? Eleanor asked, skeptical of the idea. I am not yet certain, Alexander admitted, but I recall your sister's earlier suggestion about understanding Cedric's true motivations. If his pursuit of you stems from wounded pride following his earlier failed engagement to Margaret Fenwick, perhaps what he genuinely seeks is not your ruin specifically, but validation of his own worth among society. Eleanor considered this theory carefully, recognizing its potential merit. You believe if we found a way to restore his reputation, to give him something that satisfies his wounded pride, he might abandon his pursuit of us entirely. It is worth investigating, Alexander said, though we must proceed carefully. A man driven by pride can be unpredictable, and any approach we make must be handled with great precision to avoid making the situation worse. Over the following days, Alexander made careful, discreet inquiries into Cedric's current circumstances, searching for any opportunity that might align with their theory. Eventually, he discovered that Cedric had been quietly seeking investment partners for a new business venture, one that had thus far failed to attract sufficient support due to his damaged reputation among the county's wealthier families. This could be our opportunity, Alexander said, sharing his discovery with Eleanor during one of their evening walks. If I were to publicly support his venture, offering my own investment and encouraging other respected families to do the same, it would restore significant credibility to his reputation. You would help him, after everything he has done to threaten us? Eleanor asked, surprised by the generosity of the proposal. Not out of kindness toward Cedric specifically, Alexander clarified, but if it removes his motivation to expose our situation, protects your family's reputation, and ends this conflict without further scandal for anyone involved, then the investment serves a valuable purpose regardless of my personal feelings toward the man. Eleanor considered the strategy carefully, recognizing both its cleverness and its risk. And if he simply accepts your help while continuing his threats regardless, then we will have lost nothing beyond a modest investment, Alexander said. But I suspect Cedric's pride runs deeper than his desire for revenge. Given genuine validation, genuine social standing restored through legitimate means, I believe he may find continuing his pursuit against us far less appealing than accepting the opportunity we offer instead. The following week, Alexander arranged a private meeting with Cedric, carefully choosing neutral ground away from public observation. Eleanor waited anxiously at home, uncertain how the confrontation would unfold, hoping desperately that Alexander's theory about Cedric's true motivations would prove accurate. When Alexander finally returned late that evening, his expression carried a complicated mixture of relief and continued caution. How did it go? Eleanor asked immediately, searching his face for any indication of the outcome. Better than I expected, though not without complications, Alexander said, settling into the chair across from her. Cedric was initially defensive, suspicious of my motives for offering assistance, but when I proposed the investment partnership, framing it as recognition of his business acumen rather than charity, his demeanor shifted considerably. Did he agree to abandon his threats against us? Eleanor asked hopefully. He agreed to reconsider his position, Alexander said carefully, though he made no explicit promise to abandon his pursuit entirely. I believe we have created an opportunity, but the outcome still remains uncertain. Eleanor felt a complicated mixture of relief and continued anxiety at this news, recognizing that while progress had been made, the danger Cedric represented had not yet been fully resolved. As she considered the uncertain path still ahead of them, she found herself grateful, once again, for the partnership that had grown between herself and Alexander. A partnership built not merely on performance and pretense, but increasingly on genuine trust and mutual support during difficult circumstances neither of them had anticipated facing together. 2 weeks passed with no further word from Cedric, and slowly, cautiously, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that perhaps Alexander's strategy had genuinely succeeded in neutralizing the threat that had hung over their engagement for so long. During this peaceful interval, the relationship between Eleanor and Alexander continued deepening in ways that surprised them both. What had begun as careful, rehearsed performances for the benefit of watching society had transformed into something entirely different. Conversations that stretched late into the evening, shared laughter over private jokes only they understood, quiet moments of genuine affection that required no audience to feel meaningful. One evening, as they sat together in the drawing room of the Ashworth estate, a fire crackling softly in the hearth, Alexander turned to Eleanor with an expression she had not seen from him before, nervous in a way that felt entirely unfamiliar for a man usually so composed. "I have been considering something," he said carefully, "and I wanted to discuss it with you before proceeding any further." "You seem unusually hesitant," Eleanor observed, setting down her tea and giving him her full attention. "What is troubling you?" "Nothing troubling exactly," Alexander said, though his continued hesitation suggested otherwise. "I have been thinking about our arrangement, about how it began, and about how significantly things have changed between us since that first difficult evening." Eleanor felt her heart quicken slightly, sensing the direction of his thoughts even before he continued. "Go on," she said softly. "When we first agreed to this engagement," Alexander continued, "we established that it would end quietly after several months, once your reputation had fully recovered, and Cedric's original accusations had faded from memory. But I find myself unable to imagine following through with that original plan." "Because your feelings have changed," Eleanor said quietly, not quite a question. "Because I no longer wish for this engagement to end at all," Alexander said, his voice steadier now despite his earlier nervousness. "Eleanor, what began as a necessary deception has become the most genuine and meaningful relationship I have experienced in my adult life. I do not wish to pretend any longer. I wish for this engagement to become real, permanently, if you are willing." Eleanor felt tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his words. "I have felt the same way for weeks now," she admitted. "I have been afraid to voice it, uncertain whether you felt similarly, or whether I was simply confusing gratitude with something deeper." "There is nothing confused about what I feel," Alexander said, reaching for her hand and holding it gently. "I love you, Eleanor. Not the version of you performing for society's benefit, but the genuine woman I have come to know through countless quiet conversations and shared difficulties. I wish to marry you, truly, not as a solution to a temporary problem, but as the beginning of a genuine life together." Eleanor's breath caught at his words, the weight of his sincerity settling over her like warm sunlight after a long winter. "I love you too," she said softly. "I did not expect to find genuine happiness within an arrangement that began through such difficult circumstances, but I cannot deny what has grown between us, and I do not wish to imagine a future without you in it." Alexander's expression softened, with visible relief and joy, and he leaned forward to kiss her gently, a kiss entirely different from either of their previous encounters, filled with quiet certainty rather than performance or exploration. When they finally parted, Alexander reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, his hands slightly unsteady as he opened it to reveal a delicate ring, simple but elegant, clearly chosen, with careful thought rather than mere obligation. "This was my mother's ring," he explained softly. "She wore it throughout her marriage to my father, and I have kept it safely stored since her passing, uncertain whether I would ever find someone deserving of wearing it. I can think of no one more deserving than you, Eleanor." Eleanor felt fresh tears spilling down her cheeks as she accepted the ring, allowing Alexander to slide it gently onto her finger. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you for trusting me with something so precious to you." "I trust you with everything," Alexander said simply. "My family's legacy, my genuine happiness, and now, I hope, my entire future." They sat together for a long while afterward, discussing the practical matters of transforming their arrangement into a genuine, permanent commitment. They would need to inform their families of the shift, though Eleanor's mother would undoubtedly be thrilled regardless of the details, and they would need to begin planning an actual wedding, rather than maintaining the pretense of an eventual quiet separation. "There is still the matter of Cedric," Eleanor said eventually, the lingering worry resurfacing despite the joy of the evening. "Even if his silence has continued these past weeks, we cannot be entirely certain the danger has passed." "We will face whatever comes," Alexander said firmly. "Together, as genuine partners, rather than merely performers, maintaining a careful fiction. Whatever Cedric attempts, our commitment to one another now stands on solid ground, regardless of how our engagement originally began." The following morning, Eleanor shared the news with her family, watching her mother's reaction shift from surprised confusion to overwhelming joy as she processed the reality that the engagement, previously understood to be a temporary arrangement, had transformed into something genuinely permanent. "I knew it," her mother said, embracing her tightly. "From the very first evening, I suspected there was something real growing between you both, despite whatever practical reasons initially brought you together." Charlotte, too, expressed genuine happiness for her sister, though her expression carried a hint of knowing amusement. "I told you, did I not? That consideration you noticed in him from the very beginning was never simply careful calculation. It was the beginning of genuine affection, whether either of you recognized it at the time or not." As the family celebrated the joyful news, Eleanor found herself overwhelmed with genuine happiness, a feeling entirely different from the anxious uncertainty that had characterized so much of the preceding weeks. Whatever challenges still remained ahead, whatever uncertainty Cedric's continued silence might still represent, she felt confident, for the first time since this entire complicated situation began, that she was building toward a future she genuinely wanted, rather than simply surviving a difficult circumstance thrust upon her. Yet even amid this joyful celebration, a small worry continued nagging at the edges of Eleanor's happiness. Cedric's silence, rather than providing true reassurance, felt increasingly like the quiet before a storm, and she could not entirely shake the feeling that their genuine happiness was about to face its most significant test yet. The joy of the genuine engagement lasted only a handful of days before Eleanor's quiet worry proved entirely justified. A formal invitation arrived at the Whitfield estate, addressed to the entire family, requesting their presence at a grand gathering hosted by Lord and Lady Marchbanks, the same family who had so eagerly praised Eleanor and Alexander's supposedly romantic beginning weeks earlier. The invitation mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Cedric Ashby would also be attending as a guest of honor, given his newly announced business partnership with several prominent families in the county. Eleanor felt immediate unease upon reading the invitation, recognizing that Cedric's continued silence had not indicated genuine surrender, but rather careful patience, waiting for an opportunity to act when the audience and circumstances aligned most favorably for whatever plan he had been quietly assembling. "We must attend," Alexander said, when Eleanor shared her concerns during their next visit. "Refusing the invitation would only raise suspicion, particularly given how publicly our engagement has been celebrated throughout the county." "I fear this is precisely what Cedric intends," Eleanor said anxiously. "A grand public setting, exactly the kind of stage he used against me once before. If he intends to expose our original deception, this gathering provides the perfect opportunity." "Then we must be prepared," Alexander said firmly. "Whatever he intends to reveal, we will face it directly, with honesty, rather than continued denial. Our engagement is genuine now, regardless of how it began. That truth alone should provide sufficient protection against whatever accusations he intends to make." Despite Alexander's confident reassurance, Eleanor spent the following days consumed by anxiety, imagining countless scenarios of how the evening might unfold, each more damaging than the last. She barely slept the night before the gathering, and by the time their carriage arrived at the Marchbanks estate, her nerves felt stretched to their breaking point. The grand ballroom, filled with glittering chandeliers and elegantly dressed guests, felt eerily similar to the evening this entire situation had begun, and Eleanor found herself instinctively searching the crowd for Cedric's familiar figure, dreading the moment their paths would inevitably cross. She did not have to wait long. Within the first hour of the gathering, Cedric approached them directly, his expression carrying a confidence that immediately confirmed Eleanor's worst fears. "Your Grace." "Miss Whitfield," Cedric said smoothly, his tone carrying none of the earlier anger from their previous confrontation. "How wonderful to see you both again, particularly given the joyful news I have heard regarding your genuine commitment to one another." Eleanor's stomach twisted at his words, uncertain whether his tone suggested genuine acceptance or dangerous mockery preceding some larger revelation. "Thank you, Cedric," Alexander said carefully, his own guard clearly raised despite his composed exterior. "I trust your new business venture has been progressing well, given the generous support you have received from several respected families." "Indeed, it has," Cedric said, his smile widening slightly. "Your investment, along with your public endorsement, has restored considerable credibility to my reputation. I find myself, rather unexpectedly, grateful for your generosity." Eleanor exchanged a cautious glance with Alexander, daring to hope that perhaps their earlier strategy had genuinely succeeded, that Cedric's gratitude might finally overcome whatever remaining resentment he harbored. However, Cedric continued, his tone shifting subtly. Gratitude does not entirely erase certain lingering questions I still hold regarding the true origins of your engagement. I wonder, Miss Whitfield, whether you might indulge my curiosity by sharing the genuine story of how your relationship with the Duke truly began. The demand hung in the air, dangerous and calculated, drawing the attention of several nearby guests who had begun listening with obvious curiosity. Eleanor felt her heart pounding fiercely, recognizing that Cedric intended to force a public confrontation, regardless of his earlier expressions of gratitude. Before she could formulate a careful response, Alexander stepped forward, his expression calm despite the tension clearly visible in his posture. "Since you ask so directly," Alexander said, his voice carrying easily across the growing crowd of curious onlookers, "I see no reason to withhold the truth any longer." Eleanor's breath caught, uncertain what Alexander intended to reveal, fearing the worst despite her trust in his judgment. "Our engagement began," Alexander continued, "on an evening when Miss Whitfield faced a cruel and false accusation, publicly, in front of an entire ballroom of witnesses. I intervened because I could not stand by and watch such injustice unfold. What followed was, admittedly, a hasty decision made without full consideration of its consequences." Murmurs spread through the gathering crowd, and Eleanor felt her cheeks burning, uncertain where Alexander's honesty was leading them. "However," Alexander continued, his voice growing steadier, "what began as a hasty decision to protect an innocent woman's reputation has, over these past months, grown into something entirely genuine. I did not fall in love with a performance, ladies and gentlemen. I fell in love with Eleanor Whitfield herself, through countless genuine conversations, shared difficulties, and mutual respect that developed naturally over time. Whatever began this engagement, its continuation is entirely real, and I intend to marry this remarkable woman, regardless of how our story began." The crowd fell silent, absorbing this unexpected honesty, and Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes at the courage Alexander had just displayed, choosing truth over careful denial, even at the risk of public scrutiny. Cedric's expression flickered with visible frustration, clearly having expected a different reaction, perhaps hoping for embarrassed denial rather than confident honesty. "A touching story," he said finally, though his voice carried less confidence than before, "though I wonder how many in attendance believe such convenient honesty, offered only once directly questioned." "Believe whatever you wish," Alexander said calmly. "I have nothing further to hide, and nothing further to prove. Miss Whitfield's honor was never truly in question, except through your own cruel accusations months ago. If anyone here should feel embarrassed by tonight's revelations, Ashby, I suspect it is you, not us." A ripple of quiet agreement spread through the surrounding guests, several of whom, Eleanor realized with growing relief, had clearly grown weary of Cedric's continued scheming and cruel behavior over recent months. Rather than damaging her reputation further, Alexander's honest confession seemed instead to be turning public sympathy firmly against Cedric himself. Recognizing the shifting tide of opinion, Cedric offered a stiff, awkward bow. "Congratulations to you both," he said tightly, before turning and disappearing quickly into the crowd, his earlier confidence entirely deflated. Once he had gone, Eleanor turned to Alexander, overwhelmed with gratitude and admiration for the courage he had just displayed. "You did not need to reveal so much," she whispered. "You could have simply denied his accusations entirely. I did not wish to build our future together upon continued deception," Alexander said gently. "You deserve a genuine beginning, Eleanor, free from lingering secrets or fear of exposure. Tonight, I chose honesty, and I do not regret it." Eleanor felt overwhelming love and gratitude swelling within her chest, recognizing the depth of commitment Alexander had just demonstrated. Choosing vulnerability and truth over careful self-protection, purely for her benefit. As the evening continued, several guests approached them with genuine warmth, expressing admiration for the honesty they had witnessed, and Eleanor realized, with growing relief, that whatever damage Cedric had hoped to inflict had instead backfired entirely, strengthening rather than weakening the genuine respect surrounding their relationship. Yet even amid this unexpected triumph, Eleanor understood that Cedric's public humiliation following so quickly after his earlier defeat, would likely provoke a reaction far more dangerous than anything he had attempted before. As she glanced across the ballroom, catching a final glimpse of Cedric's furious expression before he disappeared into the night, she could not shake the unsettling feeling that the true climax of their conflict was still waiting, somewhere in the days ahead. A week after the Marchbanks gathering, an unexpected letter arrived at the Ashworth estate, this one bearing Cedric's own seal, requesting an urgent private meeting with Alexander alone. Alexander shared the letter with Eleanor immediately, both of them uncertain what to make of this sudden shift from public confrontation to private request. "Do you believe this is another trap?" Eleanor asked, studying the careful handwriting with suspicion. "I do not know," Alexander admitted, "but refusing to meet him would only prolong our uncertainty. Perhaps it is better to face whatever he intends directly, rather than waiting anxiously for his next move." Despite Eleanor's concerns, Alexander agreed to the meeting, choosing a public location for safety, a quiet tea house in the nearby town, where witnesses would be present should Cedric attempt anything untoward. When Alexander returned that evening, his expression carried an unexpected complexity, neither triumphant nor troubled, but something more thoughtful entirely. "What happened?" Eleanor asked immediately, searching his face for clues. "Cedric has decided to leave the county," Alexander said slowly. "Permanently. He intends to relocate to London, pursuing his business ventures there instead, away from the reputation he has damaged so thoroughly here, through his own actions." Eleanor felt a wave of cautious relief, though her suspicion remained. "Why would he tell you this directly? What does he hope to gain?" "He asked for one final favor," Alexander explained. "A letter of introduction to certain business contacts in London, given the credibility my endorsement now carries, following our public investment in his venture. In exchange, he promised to never again involve himself in our affairs, nor speak of the circumstances surrounding our engagement to anyone in the future." "Do you believe him?" Eleanor asked carefully. Alexander considered the question seriously before answering. "I believe his pride has finally been sufficiently wounded by his public defeat at the Marchbanks gathering. Remaining in this county now would mean facing continued humiliation, given how thoroughly public opinion has turned against him. London offers him a fresh start, an opportunity to rebuild his reputation, somewhere his previous failures are not yet known." "And you agreed to provide the introduction?" Eleanor asked. "I did," Alexander said. "It costs us little, and it provides him a genuine incentive to leave us permanently in peace. Sometimes, Eleanor, the wisest resolution to conflict is not continued confrontation, but simply allowing an opponent a graceful path toward retreat." Eleanor considered this wisdom carefully, recognizing the truth within it. Cedric's pride had driven every action throughout this entire difficult situation, and offering him a means of preserving that pride, even while removing him from their lives entirely, seemed a remarkably practical solution to a conflict that could otherwise have continued indefinitely. Over the following weeks, true to his word, Cedric quietly departed the county, and gradually, the lingering tension that had shadowed Eleanor and Alexander's relationship since its earliest days began to genuinely dissolve. For the first time since the fateful evening at the ballroom, Eleanor found herself able to fully relax into her happiness, free from the constant anxiety of impending exposure or confrontation. With Cedric's threat finally resolved, Eleanor and Alexander turned their full attention toward planning their genuine wedding, a celebration far removed from the careful performances that had characterized their earlier public appearances. "I want a wedding that reflects who we actually are," Eleanor said one afternoon, as they reviewed potential plans together in the drawing room. "Not an elaborate spectacle designed to impress society, but something genuine and meaningful, surrounded by people who truly matter to us." "I could not agree more," Alexander said, "though I suspect your mother may have rather different ideas regarding the scale of our celebration." Eleanor laughed softly, acknowledging the truth of his observation. "She has already begun drafting guest lists that seem to include half the county. I shall need to gently redirect her enthusiasm toward something more modest." As their wedding planning continued, Eleanor found herself reflecting often on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this point, beginning with a moment of public humiliation that had transformed, through unexpected circumstances, into the genuine love and partnership she now shared with Alexander. One evening, As they walked together through the same gardens where Alexander had first shared his mother's favorite lake, Eleanor found herself sharing these reflections aloud. "It is strange," she said thoughtfully, "to consider how differently our lives might have unfolded, had you not intervened that evening at the ball. I might have faced ruin at Cedric's hands, my family's reputation destroyed, my future prospects severely limited. And I might have continued my isolated existence indefinitely," Alexander added, "never allowing myself the vulnerability required for genuine connection with another person. Your strength that evening, standing firm, despite the cruelty directed against you, changed something within me that I did not fully understand until much later." "Do you regret the difficulty our arrangement caused?" Eleanor asked. "The deception, the anxiety, the constant fear of exposure we endured for so many months?" Alexander considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret the pain it caused you specifically," he said. "The anxiety, the fear, the burden placed upon you without your full consent. But I cannot regret the outcome, Eleanor. Whatever difficult path brought us here, I would not trade the genuine love we have built together for any alternative, however much simpler that alternative might have been." Eleanor felt her heart swell with genuine happiness at his words, recognizing the truth within them despite the difficulties they had endured together. "I feel precisely the same," she admitted. "Strange as it seems, I find myself grateful, in a way, for that terrible evening at the ball, simply because it eventually led us here, to this moment, to this genuine happiness neither of us anticipated finding." As they continued walking through the peaceful gardens, discussing their future together with growing excitement and anticipation, Eleanor allowed herself, finally and completely, to release the lingering anxiety that had characterized so much of their journey together. Whatever challenges still awaited them in married life, she felt confident that the foundation of trust, honesty, and genuine partnership they had built together would carry them successfully through whatever difficulties the future might hold. On the morning of her wedding, Eleanor stood before the tall mirror in her bedroom, watching her mother carefully arrange the final details of her gown, while Charlotte fussed happily, with the delicate flowers woven through her hair. "I can hardly believe this day has finally arrived," her mother said, her eyes glistening with emotion as she stepped back to admire her daughter fully. "After everything you have endured these past months, you truly deserve this happiness, Eleanor." "Thank you, Mother," Eleanor said softly, feeling her own emotions rising as the significance of the day settled fully upon her. "I could not have imagined, standing humiliated in that ballroom so many months ago, that such an evening would eventually lead to this moment." Charlotte squeezed her sister's hand gently. "Sometimes the most difficult beginnings lead to the most beautiful outcomes," she said. "You have shown remarkable strength and grace throughout this entire journey, Eleanor. Alexander is fortunate to have found someone so genuinely deserving of his love." As the carriage carried Eleanor toward the small country church chosen for their intimate ceremony, she found herself reflecting once more on the remarkable path that had brought her to this moment. The frightened young woman who had stood helpless against Cedric's cruelty had grown, through unexpected circumstances, into a confident woman, ready to build a genuine life, alongside a man she loved deeply. The church, though modest compared to the grand ballrooms where their public performance had once played out, felt infinitely more meaningful, filled only with family and genuine friends who had witnessed the true evolution of their relationship over recent months. As Eleanor walked down the simple aisle, she caught sight of Alexander waiting at the altar, his expression carrying none of the careful composure he typically maintained in public settings, but instead, an openness and genuine emotion that brought fresh tears to her eyes. When she finally reached him, he took her hands gently, his voice steady, despite the visible emotion in his eyes. "You look absolutely radiant," he whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. "I feel radiant," Eleanor whispered back, smiling, despite the tears gathering in her own eyes. The ceremony proceeded simply and beautifully, filled with genuine vows spoken directly from their hearts rather than merely traditional recitations. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering erupted into genuine warm applause, entirely different from the curious murmurs that had once surrounded their relationship. As they walked back down the aisle together, now genuinely and permanently united, Eleanor felt an overwhelming sense of peace settle over her, the anxiety and uncertainty of recent months finally giving way entirely to genuine, uncomplicated happiness. Later, during the modest celebration held at the Ashworth estate, Eleanor found a quiet moment alone with Alexander, away from the joyful chatter of their gathered family and friends. "Do you remember," she said softly, "standing in that ballroom, utterly humiliated, wondering how my life had been thrown into such chaos within a single evening?" "I remember," Alexander said, his arm wrapping gently around her waist. "I remember thinking, even then, despite the chaos of the moment, that I had never witnessed such quiet strength and dignity in someone facing such unjust cruelty. And now look at us," Eleanor said, glancing around at their joyful celebration. "Genuinely married, genuinely happy, with Cedric's threats finally resolved, and our future entirely our own to build." "I could not have imagined this outcome," Alexander admitted, "when I made that impulsive decision to intervene on your behalf. I acted then out of simple justice, a desire to prevent unnecessary cruelty. I never anticipated that decision would eventually lead to the greatest happiness of my entire life." Eleanor turned to face him fully, her expression filled with genuine love and gratitude. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the most difficult beginnings truly do lead to the most beautiful outcomes. Exactly as Charlotte reminded me this morning. I would not change a single moment of our difficult journey together, Alexander, knowing it eventually led us here, to this genuine happiness we now share." As the sun began setting over the Ashworth estate, casting warm golden light across the celebrating gathering, Eleanor allowed herself to fully embrace the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. What had begun as a desperate act of protection during a moment of public humiliation had transformed, through genuine care, honesty, and mutual respect, into a lasting partnership built on authentic love rather than mere convenience or necessity. Cedric, wherever he now found himself building his new life in London, had ultimately provided an unintended gift through his cruelty, forcing together two people who might never have found one another otherwise, whose genuine connection had grown stronger through every difficulty they faced together. As Eleanor danced with her husband beneath the golden evening sky, surrounded by genuine friends and family who had witnessed their entire journey from scandal to genuine happiness, she understood completely that her honor, once threatened by cruel deception, had not only been restored, but had ultimately led her toward a love far more genuine and lasting than she could ever have imagined finding through more conventional circumstances. Their story, born from injustice and deception, had ultimately become a testament to genuine love's ability to grow, even from the most difficult and unlikely beginnings, a truth Eleanor would carry with her throughout the remainder of her life, alongside the man who had once kissed her to defend her honor, and who had, through that single impulsive act, ultimately changed both their lives forever.